Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm Coach, mother of four, and potty talker, Ann-Kaplan. This is the podcast where I confess something from my own parenting and coaching life, teach a lesson around it, and answer your questions. Even we parenting experts are far from perfect, and the real magic happens when we get down with all that imperfection. We get into the gritty side of parenting here, so earbud up and dive in.
Welcome into another episode of the podcast, listeners. I'm excited to do something a little different with you all this week. I've never done this before, but it's like listener mailbag. And so my confession for you is that I was really stumped at coming up with a topic for today. Happens to me sometimes, especially when I'm recording things in advance and things like that. And I went out and told my listeners and said, give me all of your parenting topics. I'm stumped. I can't think of something to talk about. And I got such great questions. I was like, this is great. Today's going to be listener mailbag. So there you go. From my confession of not having any ideas comes this really cool idea. So let us dive right into all these questions because I think some of them are pretty good and um they really run the gamut for kids' ages, but I think they're applicable to everybody. So I think it's going to be great. So the first one comes from Sarah, and her question is, she says, winding down / transitioning school aged kids, especially elementary kids, after school without electronics. Love this topic. In fact, I just got off a call with a dad earlier where we talked about transitions and how tricky they can be, whether it's after school or after an activity, coming back into the house and all of that stuff. So let's talk about that. And she had a follow-up question, which is, should it be kid-led for coming home and transitioning or parent-led, or should we be doing this together? So many kids don't transition well from school to home or after school activities. Totally agree with this. It is really hard to change gears. And anybody who is working in addition, on top of the work of parenting knows how hard it is to change gears for us as adults. So it makes perfect sense that kids, especially younger kids, really struggle with it. So definitely love Sarah's instinct to say no electronics. Electronics do not help with transition because what we need to transition or change gears from one thing to another is presence and space and calm. And electronics do not give us any sort of presence or calmness. They actually dysregulate us and stimulate us. So from the outside, it might look like your kid is calm because you've sort of like zombified them by putting them under the spell of an electronic. But what you're really doing is just postponing. Like that transition still needs to happen. It's just that it's not happening like in their nervous system. It's not happening right now. It's going to happen when you turn off the electronics. So you're just, procrastinating and probably exacerbating the challenge of that transition, because now this kiddo didn't get their transition time to come home. Then they put a bunch more electronic, like dysregulating stuff into their system. And now they have to transition with even more stuff to transition from, if that makes sense. So definitely no electronics. I'm going to tell you what I tell my clients who deal with transitions from one parent's house to the other parent's house. So in separated families, this works wonders. And it is such a great tool for after school transition as well, which is, first of all, plan as little as possible. So you come home from school, this transition stuff might even start in the car on the way home from school. Nothing is planned. We're not in a rush. We're not going somewhere. I know it can be tempting. Your kid gets out at 3:55 to sign them up for the 4:10 gymnastics class. Don't do it. It's better for you to have a window, even too, quote unquote, too long of a window, than rush, rush, rush. So plan as little as possible and create as much space as possible for that transition. And then you need to be transitioning too. So what do I mean by that is, like, we need to be not coming home and even if we are giving our kids time and space to transition, we're buzz, immediately go into making dinner or immediately go into sitting back in front of our computer or running around the house, doing housework or whatever like that. No, both of you need to chill out. And so my suggestion, especially for younger kids, obviously once your kid is a teenager or a middle-aged student, you might not need to be such an active part of this, but remember that kids are co-regulating with us all the time, even older kids. So your energy matters in this transition. So come home and create some space with younger kids. To answer Sarah's question about parent led versus kid led, I think that parent led is great for that, for the younger kids for sure. And once kids are older, they can be a little bit more involved. But, let's talk about like maybe a first or second grader. We come home from school, nothing is happening. You literally might just sit on the couch together and hold hands. I have a client who, every time that she goes through transitions with her kids, that's what they do. They just sit on the couch together and snuggle. They don't do anything. They don't listen to anything. They have nothing else, no more input coming in. They just sit there. And that's what they need. And that's really, really great. So do that, and whatever version of that is. So I have clients who they have like a stack of books by the couch and they sit on the couch and they read a book or two. I have some clients who sit and they talk about their day. I have some clients who sit and they have a basket of snacks by the couch and they have some snacks and they just kind of chat or not and kind of just settle in. And if you were really paying attention, and this is why we need to be calm and co-regulating with our kids, you will see them just kind of like the day fall away from them and them to kind of come back into their home self. And that's another thing to really think about, is like our kids are socially adjusting themselves, or to use a more modern term, they're kind of code switching all day. They have a version of themselves that is for school or for extracurriculars, and it's different than their home self. And let them kind of come into their new next iteration of themselves, and you'll see it happening. Now when kids are older, definitely it can be parent led, but kids have some say in it. So you might say, hey, here's the boundaries around after school: no electronics for the first hour, and you know no loud music, maybe that kind of thing. And the kids can kind of find what they want to do within those parameters. That's great, especially once you got like a fourth or a fifth grader or whatever. Awesome. I hope that's helpful. I'm sure that some of this stuff is like, okay, that seems pretty logical, but you know how much we spend time kind of like spinning in our own minds and not really thinking about it. I definitely think that parents need to be involved every step of the way. I mean, honestly, until kids are maybe like sophomore or older in high school, like just giving the parameters. It does not necessarily mean that when your kid is 14 years old, you're still sitting and holding hands on the couch. Of course not. But you might still have the rule that, like, hey, we're not just going to jump out of the frying pan and into the fire here. So I'm going to hold myself to that by me being available to you, and by not overscheduling us, and all those things that me as a parent, I can do to contribute to us having the possibility of a smooth transition. And you can do the things that you need to do to be able to transition. So that was a great question. Our next question comes from Elena, and she asked about curfew, especially for kids who are old enough to go out by themselves and stuff like that, but not so old that you really don't think about it and they're kind of the boss of their time. And for different families, those ages are different. So, in some families, it's like once you're in high school, you're on your own, basically. For some families, it's not until you're 18. Whatever that time frame is for you, where it's like, yeah, you are a kid who gets to go out and come back, with your own volition, but there's still a curfew here. You know, Elena had a question about, well, how do we do that in a way that still honors our kids' independence and is like age appropriate and all of that stuff? And the answer for that is, well, once again, different for every family in terms of like what is that age and what is that curfew. But either way, my suggestion is always, and this is going to be the same answer for anything, curfew or anything else, like how do we have boundaries and enforce them while still giving kids their independence? It's everything you ever hear me talk about on this podcast. We create that container, we manage our mindset around the container, and we enforce the container, right? So for example, in our house, for my daughter who's a sophomore in high school, she has a 10:30 curfew. And as long as I know where she's at, that's it. Like, I don't call her, I don't track her on her phone, I don't do any of those other things. She has a very long leash, and she can either choose to wander as far as that leash goes and come back and make great choices, or she can use that leash to strangle herself. That's what a leash is for, right? With kids, obviously not strangling them, but you know what I'm saying. Like, we give them this long leash and we see, like, do we need to shorten it, or is that okay? And so this is the same approach with the curfew, right? So okay, so she gets to go out as long as I know where she's at. And even that is, as she's gotten older, is less and less. Like, there definitely could be times during the day where you ask me where my daughter is, and I'm like, oh, she's out with friends, not really exactly sure where. That's all fine. And her parameters are: be home on time. If I contact you, you need to respond. And and I need to know at least roughly where you are. And as long as all of those things are great, great. Here's a cool trick with the curfew. If your kids aren't following curfew, so in this case, her curfew is 10:30. If she comes home at 10:35, her curfew tomorrow is 10:25, meaning she came home 5 minutes late, so now her curfew is 5 minutes early. You come home at 11:30, your curfew tomorrow is 9:30. You lose the time that you steal. That makes sense. And for some kids, there might be a space where you take it further and say, okay, well, it looks like you just really can't handle going out. So until, we see some signs that things are a little bit more managed, you'll probably just have to stay home. And of course, that's a curfew, and going out with your friends and all that stuff is a privilege. And of course, you might have some things in your family that those privileges are tied to, like, my daughter also is doing well in school and she's taking care of her responsibilities and her chores and things like that. But in terms of like actually sitting down and talking to your kid about curfew, really just come up with like a handful of guidelines and let your kid screw it up. This is the biggest, most important thing about that whole idea of creating a container is your kid can totally screw up inside of that container. There's no way to construct a container that guarantees our kids are going to make good decisions and stay on track. They're supposed to go off track, and the container is what keeps them from going way too far off track, but they're supposed to screw up. So let your kid miss curfew. Don't remind them, and then give them the consequence and stay calm, manage your mindset around it, and all of those great things. If you're feeling anxious about your child being out by themselves, that is a you thing. And that might sound harsh for me to say, right? Like, it might feel like I'm saying, your kid's great. You're crazy to be worried about them. That's not what I'm saying. But if your child is at the age where you've chosen to give them a curfew and give them that freedom, and yet you are still like biting your nails and, breaking out in a sweat when they're not home, that is your work. And it's very real. Those feelings can be very real. And we need to work on it because it is appropriate for kids at a certain age to start having that longer leash, for sure, even if we don't like it. So you've heard me say here before, if you're feeling anxious about your child, treat your anxiety, not your child. Like, that is what we need to be doing as parents. And a curfew is a really great example of where that comes up. Okay. One last question in the listener mailbag, and then I'm going to encourage you all to send me your questions because I love this. I'm going to do another mailbag at one of these times. Okay. Here's a great question. How to continue working on empathy and sympathy in teens? That is sometimes so hard. Oh my gosh. Great question. And you're totally right. It is hard. Teens, I always say, like, I would rather give car keys to a 9-year-old than 14-year-old. Because kids, until their puberty really kicks in, they're getting progressively like smarter, more aware, more, connected, having a little bit of this like internal compass and all of that stuff. And then adolescence comes and it's like it practically feels like you're back to square one with these kids, and they're just as impulsive and just as selfish as a toddler. There are some people who call toddlerhood the first adolescence. Like they also call toddlers like three-nagers and stuff like that. Like, yeah, toddlers and teenagers have a lot in common. And it is devastating to watch a kiddo just demonstrate a lack of values. And it's really, really hard to remember that this probably isn't who they are at their core, that all of that stuff that you've stuck in there, all that empathy that you've been teaching them, all of those great values about social justice or whatever that you've put in there, they're still in there. It's just that new stuff has also come in there. And that new stuff is much more distracting and attention grabbing than that old stuff. And over time, that old stuff will, or that new stuff will become old. It'll settle out, and all of that stuff that's at the core. Have you ever had like a bag of like mixed nuts or something like that? And if you shake, the container of nuts, those heavier, more dense and like powerful, for lack of a better word, like substantial is the word I'm looking for. Those denser, bigger, more substantial nuts, as you shake your mixed nuts, those all rise to the surface. That's what's going to happen over the course of your kids' adolescence. Those denser, more substantial pieces of themselves, that stuff that you stuck in there when they were younger, that's still in there, and it will rise back up to the surface. In the meantime, you are going to be watching a kid who is selfishly motivated, compromising and violating their values, super impulsive. And there are going to be times where you're like, how could this possibly have happened? Where did I go wrong? How did my child show up and turn out to be this way? Your teenager has not turned out to be anything yet. You're still seeing the goo. So another analogy I really like to use is, you know, I don't know if everybody knows this. Like I've said this to certain people, and some people are like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And other people are like, oh, I didn't know that before. I was astounded when I learned this. But like, did you know that when a caterpillar creates a chrysalis and then starts to metamorphosize either into a moth or a butterfly or whatever, like, do you know what happens when they are inside that chrysalis? I didn't know. I kind of imagine like, oh, well, maybe they kind of still look like a caterpillar, but they start sprouting wings and their little tiny feet go away. And, I just kind of thought they sort of like um morphed into the next version of themselves just by like growing and adding new stuff and taking away old stuff, and that kind of thing. Maybe their antenna grow longer, and they sprout wing buds or something like that. That is not how butterflies and moths are created. What happens inside that chrysalis is the caterpillar turns into a complete liquid. It liquefies itself and turns into like this primordial soup that then towards the end of that metamorphosis then congeals in this whole new shape. That is what teenagers are doing. Like I said, they go back to basics. They go back to the goo that they were before they became 12 or 13 or 14. They turn back into goo, and they're really gooey and nothing. They're like blobs that are just like ingredients of a person for several years, and then they start to reassemble themselves and take all those ingredients and turn themselves into a young adult. When you say to yourself, how could my child have turned out this way? It's important to remember that your child hasn't turned out yet. You're just looking at the goo and saying, oh my gosh, how did I make this messy glob? I was trying to make a butterfly. You didn't make a messy glob. That's just the middle stage. Okay. So, with all that being said, keep that all in your mind. And then we can start talking about empathy. And this is where boundaries actually come in a big way, because the place where you're going to see the least amount of empathy probably is for yourself and the other people in your family. And it's a little bit of a transition. I did a podcast episode a long time ago about this like kind of mindset shift that happens when our kids get to be around 4 months old, where all of a sudden, instead of it being like baby led latch, babies sleep when they're sleepy and they eat when they want to eat, and we respond to their cries immediately, all of a sudden this cognitive development happens, and we actually need to change roles with our kids and go from like letting them be in charge to, wait a second, I'm in charge here, I'm the boss, I'm not going to get up 4 times a night and feed you anymore, like that's ridiculous. And we it can be kind of like a whiplash moment for us as parents, teenagers, and like older kids, even preteens. That's another whiplash moment where it's like, wait a minute, I actually can demand some reciprocity in our relationship. And that is actually teaching empathy. I don't know about you, but I definitely have had moments with my teenagers where I feel like they just see me as like a vending machine that gives them money or food or drives places, like I'm just like this machine that gives them the things that they want for their life. Last week I was a computer vending machine because my daughter needed a new computer for school, okay? And it's very rude and it's super thoughtless, and the kids don't even pay attention to the fact that maybe you're like in the middle of something, or maybe you had a hard day, like stuff that anybody walking into a room and seeing you would be able to say, "Oh, hey, are you okay?" You're not going to get that from a teenager. But what you can do is say things like, I hear what you're saying. I just had a really bad day and I'll talk to you about this later. I'm not going to talk to you about it right now. And you also can say things like, I'm really happy to take you guys to the mall, or, pay for you to blah, blah, blah. As soon as you and I have had a couple of, meaningful interactions, because I really haven't seen you or spoken to you in the last week or so. Start introducing reciprocity into your relationship. Never, especially not right now, are you becoming peers with your child. No, no, no. Maybe later when they're like in their 30s, you can explore that. But just because you're not peers doesn't mean that there's not a maturation happening in the dynamic between you and your child. So really start to think about that reciprocity concept and saying, you haven't really treated me very well or even looked me in the eye recently. So I'm really not feeling it with taking you to get boba or whatever it is. And just really start, your child's awareness of you being a human being is only going to happen from you demonstrating to them that you're a human being and treating yourself like a human being. And that reciprocity is the gateway to empathy. It's making sure that empathy still stays as one of those ingredients in the goo, or one of those substantial nuts in the box of mixed nuts. You're really just keeping that as like this like reminder of like, yeah, I get it. You are a selfish teenager and that's all well and good. And just making sure you still remember that I'm a human being and that other people around you are human beings. And that's where it goes. And then the last thing I'll say about that is manage your own emotions about this, because watching your child be somebody that, to be honest, like you probably wouldn't have a whole lot of respect for if you were to just meet them on the street, it is a gut wrenching experience. And even though I just told you all the stuff about the goo and the nuts and the blah, 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 it can feel embarrassing. It can feel very worrisome because, like, okay, cool. Some lady on a podcast told me my kid is goo, but like, I don't see evidence of that. Like, where's the butterfly? When's that happening? I don't know. What if they just stay like this forever? Right. So it can be worrisome. It can be honestly downright mortifying or shameful, some of our children's behavior. And you are going to have all those emotions. You'll be angry, you'll be resentful. I definitely, this doesn't happen often because I like to do this work and practice what I preach, but I definitely have gotten very resentful with several of my children over time, where it's just like, you are so selfish. Do you not see that there's a human being standing in front of you? This is so rude. Like, how could you speak to somebody like this? Those feelings all are normal and natural and totally understandable, and they are not appropriate for them to be necessarily a part of your relationship with your child in their raw form. So make sure that you're taking care of your emotions and still feeling all those feelings and working through those feelings, so that when you come back to the conversation with your kid, you're not saying, how dare you talk to me that way, or blah, 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 but you're actually doing all the good parenting stuff. You're saying, hey, I love you so much, and I'm totally happy to do those kinds of things with you. And I feel like you are appreciative of me. And I don't feel that way right now. And that's it. Have those boundaries, and establishing reciprocity is that gateway to empathy. And make sure that you're taking care of yourself on the side. I hope that's helpful for you today. That was a really fun listener mailbag, and I would love to do a listener mailbag more often. So send me your questions. I will keep them in a little metaphoric mailbag for myself, and I promise you it will happen more and more, that my mind is a blank slate on what to include as our podcast topic. And so I will be doing more of these mailbag episodes. Have a great day, everybody. And if you are ready to have somebody in your corner who knows the answer to all of these mailbag questions, that's my gig. That's my jam. Come to one of those free discovery calls you hear me talking about all the time. Let's talk about what's going on in your family, what you want to be going on in your family, and how to make it happen, and see if I'm the right person to help you get there. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.
The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long, or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/kaplan-call, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.